First, I'd like to introduce the METEOR project, which enabled the creation of this video. METEOR stands for Modelling Exposure Through Earth Observation Routines and was funded by the UK Space Agency through their International Partnership Programme as part of the Global Challenges Research Fund. The METEOR project aims to develop innovative application of Earth observation technologies to improve understanding of exposure. Natural hazards have had escalating impacts, which are contributed to by an increasing exposure of population and assets. However, a major challenge when making disaster risk management decisions can be a poor understanding of the distribution and character of exposure. Robust quantitative methods are required to justify these decisions, and in this project, we are looking at the use of Earth observation technologies within that context. Within the METEOR project, there is also the aim to share knowledge. This video is produced as a part of a series of educational videos to enable the use of METEOR products and data.
All right, now I'll be talking about the basic process of developing exposure data. Developing exposure data is quite complicated, although you can do some work right off the bat, like any discipline, looking at vulnerability or hazard. It can get quite complicated. So you'll by no means be experts here. We won't be going into the structural engineering details. We won't be going into the GIS processing steps, remote sensing processing steps, and so forth. But I'll give you an idea of the various components and what to watch out for. And I think most importantly, it will give you an idea of how sausage is made, as we like to say, what the ingredients are, and how that will impact the decision-making process and ultimate use. So how's exposure data developed? Here's the general steps. Again, we're sort of focusing on those levels 1, 2, 3, 4. Not so much looking at if you've got building specific data available, but first collect your census data, most accurate census data you can. Second, estimate the building attributes for vulnerability, refine the spatial distribution, estimate number of buildings, and estimate the replacement value. So those are sort of 5 major steps that we'll be going through. First, collecting census data. Population census data, housing census data, if you can get a hold of it, the most recent you can. It's worth trying to get the updates that might be, more than a kind of decadal type a census, and extrapolate those to current values if you can. You generally want to get the highest resolution data that you can for the country you're looking at, a census tract type of analysis. And if you can get microcensus data, that is beneficial as well. Next, estimate building attributes. These are the type of attributes that are on the legend here in the GEM application in the upper right. These that map directly to vulnerability. It's generally good to use essentially a statistical or mapping scheme approach, and because you're not dealing with an inventory here, you don't have information about every building. So taking a statistical or what we call mapping scheme approach, and the mapping scheme is sort of slang for mapping a certain occupancy or a certain development pattern to a distribution of structural types. For example, if you were to say residential structures, you might have more wood frame buildings in some countries, or you might have more apartment buildings in some countries. Maybe people tend to live in URMs, whereas you have the commercial districts in residential neighborhoods. They might look very similar, but in downtown urban cores, they might have a very different structural distribution. So finding those groups and refining those distributions is what's required here. Lots of ways that you can do it. And obviously, you have a different approach for level 1 than you would for something along the lines of a level 4. It can be as simple as, like what we did would be for the level 1 data that we produced on the Meteor project was to do things like look at the World Housing Encyclopedia, do a lot of web-based reconnaissance, look at as much street view and photos taken in country and uh, uh, just regular satellite data, aerial photograph data that we can, and then use that to essentially make assumptions, and that's what we would call the global level. For level 3, you want to get much more accurate data. It might do a full literature review on each country to look at the predominant building construction types, a much more detailed interpretation of satellite data where you might manually extract certain areas like downtown business cores and military areas, soliciting expert opinion. You can get structural engineers who will be able to recognize some things, but a lot of times you can't see a whole lot from the outside of a building, given the cladding and so forth. So having experts that are in country who understand the construction and maybe how things change by era, how you might be able to use what you can see on the outside to interpret what's going on underneath is very useful. Virtual reconnaissance, that's the street view type approach. Site surveys, this would be the type of thing that we did on our level 3 data. We'll have a session where we discuss that in much more detail, where you actually send people out and do a stratified sample. So within a given region development pattern that you're able to identify in, say, the remote sensing data, you drop random points, and for each point, you go and collect maybe 10 buildings nearest to that point, the structural characteristics, sometimes given the occupancy distribution, if you have that type of information that you can map it to. And then that becomes the basis for extrapolating for like regions throughout the country. And of course, it's more accurate if you can collect that data in several different places in the country that might, you might have very different patterns in mountainous regions than in the valleys, or in the north of a country where it's colder than in the west, or what have you. So being able to identify those patterns and collect site surveys at multiple points is ideal. And of course, the closer those site surveys are to where the risk assessment is being done, or the more accurate it's going to be. So for example, we collected data in Dar es Salaam and Kathmandu for our level 3 analysis. We were able to determine that there wasn't significant structural differences between Dar es Salaam and the rest of the country that would have impacted those mapping schemes. But we did go through the process of looking at as much information as we could to adjust those where appropriate. For example, Zanzibar had a very different mapping scheme. So next few slides, we've just got some examples of some of those methods of collecting attribute information. You can have just paper forms that people fill out for a given area where it's very simple, where they circle a given type of structure and the details and the area of construction, for example, number of stories. Or you can have very sophisticated tools where you've got phone applications or desktop applications that tie a mapped point to observations. And of course, there's a little bit of an adjustment. The device records where you are. You have to track it associated with the building, so you have to click on the building and make sure to fill those points in, or else you'll have you'll have the recording in the wrong place, which can make a difference. A word of warning during this process: you do a random sample, but sometimes you get outliers in your random sample. If you're doing an assessment and a mapping distribution, and you happen to hit a 15-story hotel, for example, and there's only 5 of them in the country, and those get replicated in urban cores based on that one sample. You have to make the judicious decision to eliminate that point. So really you're going for trying to characterize what the most common structural patterns are. So field tools, there's IDCT tool, which I believe is still distributed by Jim, which is a very handy tool we've used quite extensively. OSM has their tools that were used in this project in Kathmandu, KL, and did that survey, as well as some surveys in Tanzania. Field Notes Pro is a common application that does a pretty good job of allowing you to take notes in the field. Very simple with a lot of flexibility. Paper surveys, just geotagged photos allow you to make an awful lot of observations. If you can just collect a lot of those without having to send engineers in the field, that can be quite nice. And again, it's ideal to link that back to the footprints. So you have those observations tied to building areas, a number of stories too. So that helps you extrapolation process. And so the results here, here's some examples, I believe, from a project we did in Indonesia. On the bottom, you see 4 different photos of buildings. These types of observations were tied to different commercial districts. And in the end, you have essentially a distribution of the total square meters and the total number of buildings, which allow you to make your remote sensing. It's you can't see as much from the sky, but you can see a lot farther, right? So for example, China's got a lot of very, very regular development of residential structures that are, well, I think these ones are 6 stories high, but sometimes they have ones that are 14 stories high, and they look very, very similar, and you can spot them in all urban cores and map them quite effectively with satellite data. So you can figure out what those are made of. You can watch them, take photos of them being constructed. You can talk to Chinese engineers and so on. But being able to have that additional satellite perspective that allows you to figure out exactly where they are and use that in your risk analysis and kind of join those 2 pieces of information is quite effective. A sort of a word of warning, don't go overboard. There's a lot of different attributes of structures that affect the vulnerability, and a lot of data out there about how that happens. But if you're doing a study and you're saying, well, for each site that we identified, we want to figure out what the occupancy is, and given the occupancy, we want to figure out what the structure type is, and then from there, whether it's a reinforced or unreinforced or confined masonry, or if we want to figure out the number of stories, and if we assign the era, you very quickly get to sort of branches in the tree of options that will be more frequent than, or have a greater number than the frequency of buildings that you're trying to distribute those, them to. So what you're really trying to do is get the solid picture of what's going on in an area. And when you can have those additional attributes that affect vulnerability, sometimes it's good to statistically represent those on the side for those doing the risk analysis to be able to assess. But if you're just using that sample data to distribute buildings in a Monte Carlo situation, you really want to go for the most common types and construction types in the buildings. And within that regard too, that allows you to sort of avoid the situation where, whoops, and this is an actual case that happened in Indonesia, where we randomly sampled a 15-story hotel, and that ended up the first run of the analysis ended up popping up 15-story hotels throughout the country. So you really want to go for the most common structural types. And next, refined spatial distribution. This is starting to drill down into some of the benefits of Earth observation data, remote sensing data. So in this sample, we have administrative units. I believe these are in Nepal. I'm not sure how large they are, but these dots are about 500 meters apart. So the buildings that are referenced in that administrative unit bin, or maybe they're not buildings, maybe they're population, represent a distribution throughout this entire area. So if you're looking at earthquake risk, that may or may not matter, distributing them evenly throughout this zone. But certainly it's more accurate, and particularly if you're starting to talk about things like a landslide or flood, to be able to localize them by these 500-meter grid cells based on where you think they are. And that is really the process of which Earth observation really helps, is localizing that distribution. And you can see in some of these areas, you're starting to characterize the valleys or the small towns that are within these administrative districts. So that's the benefit of remote sensing in that process. This term that started to pop up quite a bit, dosimetric mapping. But really what you're doing is inferring the density of buildings, of your estimated buildings within that polygon, and distributing them accordingly. That's the meat of what we've done here for the level 1 analysis, for example, for the globe. That census data that we have in that case might be quite large. And you're basically interpolating it to a finer surface with EO-based weighting. Now, several products that do this globally with population data that you can use. I'll talk about some of those later. If you don't have the expertise to do that distribution in-house, you can use some of that stuff. Landscan, WorldPop, for example. GPW PopGrid is an effort that does a good job of cataloging a lot of those and advising people when to use one over the other. But when you're really looking at buildings can be quite different from in different development patterns. Rural versus city and so forth. And you want to probably go that extra step that the population mapping doesn't do to look at the different construction patterns that you're able to basically characterize with that sampling. Next, estimate number of buildings and square footage per building. This can really impact results quite a bit, and impact the maximum amount of your losses. And the more detailed information you have about the number of essentially people per building, ultimately, and what you're trying to do. I mean, you typically start with information about how many people are where. Right, and then you have to infer from that the number of housing units, or maybe you have a distribution of the number of housing units, which gives you that. Then you have to figure out what the area of those housing units are, and then you have to apply the replacement cost, which is the next step. So there's a lot of different sources that you can get to be able to estimate the building space ultimately per person. Sometimes a housing census will do better than a population census. It will have the number of buildings sometimes, and they might even have things such as the number of rooms. If they have the number of rooms, then you can use that typically to estimate an area in meters quite effectively. If not, you have to drill down to another level of detail to try to infer that. OSM building footprint data can really help out here, but in that case, you have to really review it for areas to figure out what that relationship is between the population as estimated by the census and the number of buildings. And if you're going to use that as your parameter, you have to really review that OSM data to make sure that it's complete for that area of interest, A, and B, you have to make sure that the vintage of your census data is pretty recent, or that area of that you're using to make that adjustment has not had rapid growth in the past few years. And to do that, you can really just go back to the Google Earth platform and drill back and look at the previous aerial imagery. But if you essentially get some samples throughout the country in lieu of any other data, that will help you out. Height profiles. This can be very important if you're trying to use that OSM data and you're trying to extrapolate height out of that. Microcensus data, if you can get your hands on it, depending on how much data a country has collected, can really be very valuable here. And we used IPUM's database distributed here from the University of Minnesota to be able to make those assumptions regionally, and what we couldn't have for a specific, what we couldn't find for a specific country, we were able to basically chunk out into regions. Of course, we do provide a documentation about how we use those regions in the metadata. And the last idea here, which I guess I didn't finish, population density can also correlate with square footage in a way that can be characterized. Next, estimate the replacement value. I talked about this quite a bit earlier. Lots of different sources for this, things like Blue Book, the JRC method of trying to extrapolate based on GDP. One of my favorite things is to drill down into those resettlement action plans. But you have building value by meter, by building type, or by occupancy. Different sources break it out in different ways. You need to figure out what's the best for your project. Sometimes you can use one method in one area of the country, another method in another country. Building construction manuals can be useful, but they really tend to, particularly in developing countries, focus on the most rigorous construction in the city capitals and may not be relevant as you start to go outside those capital areas. So you have to be intelligent about how you use them and when you use them and how you might downscale values. You can use them to essentially pin a value for the most rigorous construction and characterize temporary construction or semi-permanent construction as a percentage. That can work very effectively. We've done that quite a bit in Africa. Expert opinion is good, but expert opinion can vary quite a bit. So again, it gets down to how you ask the question, how expert is your expert, and it's best if used as a data point to triangulate in on an answer if you have other sources as well. Again, that GDP by median income is an effective method. We've used that and updated it from the JRC type of approach. I encourage you to take a look at that. Scaling by building durability, I was just talking about with the temporary. And it can be quite difficult to estimate the replacement costs in developing countries. I used the example of a hut, where it may or may not be meaningful. You just have to keep that in mind, and you have to be able to communicate to people in those circumstances. Sometimes the number of buildings will be a more meaningful metric than the replacement value alone that are affected by given ground shaking. Again, I mentioned these resettlement action plans. Here's one for Tanzania. It is 2012, so that's almost 8 years ago. So that means these numbers have to be inflated based on changes in construction value. But it provides very detailed, pictures of buildings that were purchased, a description of the building, as well as a replacement cost. All that stuff is really gold when you're trying to do this type of work. Yeah. So next, the